Megan Jabori, lead course instructor at JD Advising. This video is a sample of our brand new, highly reviewed lectures that have helped countless students pass the bar exam and realize their dream of becoming lawyers. For more information, please visit jdadvising.com. You can also sign up below to get our bar exam essay guide on the highly tested topics completely free. Enjoy the video and don't forget to like and subscribe for more valuable free content. In this question, the facts state, a buyer sent an order for prompt shipment of 1,000 purple mugs to a seller. Because the seller had recently halted production of purple mugs, the seller instead shipped blue mugs and notified the buyer that the blue mugs were sent as an accommodation. The buyer received the blue mugs and sent neither a timely rejection nor an indication to the seller that the buyer would accept the non-conforming blue mugs. Months after receiving no payment for the mugs, the seller sued the buyer for breach of contract. In the action between the buyer and the seller, which party is likely to prevail? Here, the subject being tested is contracts. The legal issue was an enforceable contract breached by the buyer? If so, the seller will prevail. If not, the buyer will prevail. The applicable legal rule and analysis focuses on Article 2. Under Article 2 of the UCC, one can accept an offer in one of two ways: promising to perform or shipping the goods. Now, shipment of non-conforming goods in response to an order for prompt shipment is a counteroffer, which the buyer is free to accept or reject, so long as the seller seasonably notifies the buyer of that shipment of non-conforming goods is offered as an accommodation. However, if the shipment of non-conforming goods does not come with an accommodation letter, it's considered an acceptance and a breach. Now, turning to the issue of acceptance, acceptance occurs when a buyer notifies the seller that the buyer will keep the non-conforming goods, or they fail to make a timely notice of rejection, or they do an act inconsistent with the seller's ownership. So here, the buyer sent an offer, and the seller shipped non-conforming blue mugs in response to the buyer's order, which included a notice of accommodation. The seller's shipment therefore constituted a counteroffer. When the buyer failed to timely reject the mugs or otherwise indicate to the seller that the buyer would accept them despite their nonconformity, the buyer accepted the seller's counteroffer. Thus, the seller may successfully sue for breach of contract. So because the parties had an enforceable contract, and the buyer breached that contract by failing to pay for the accepted goods. Thus, the seller is likely to prevail in an action between the two parties. So let's turn to our answer choices to see which one reflects our conclusion. Answer choice C says just that. It states the seller, because the buyer accepted the shipment of blue mugs. And again, this is correct under Article 2 of the UCC. Shipment of non-conforming goods in response to an order for prompt shipment is a counteroffer, which the buyer is free to accept or reject, so long as the seller seasonably notifies the buyer that the shipment of non-conforming goods is offered as an accommodation. And acceptance occurs when the buyer notifies the seller that they're going to keep those non-conforming goods, or if they fail to make some sort of timely notice of rejection, or they do an act that's inconsistent with the seller's ownership. Here under our facts, the seller shipped non-conforming blue mugs in response to the buyer's order, which included a notice of accommodation. The seller's shipment therefore constituted a counteroffer. When the buyer failed to timely reject those mugs or otherwise indicate to the seller that the buyer would accept them despite their nonconformity, the buyer accepted the seller's counteroffer. Because the parties therefore had an enforceable contract, the buyer breached that contract by failing to pay for those goods that they accepted. So the seller is likely to prevail in an action between the two parties. Answer choice A says the buyer, because the seller shipped blue mugs instead of purple. A is incorrect because the acceptance of non-conforming goods, so long as the goods shipped are accompanied by an accommodation letter, creates a binding contract between the parties, as we've discussed earlier. So here the buyer is liable for breach of contract because the buyer accepted the goods even though the goods did not conform to the buyer's order. Answer choice B says the buyer, because the buyer did not accept the shipment of blue mugs. And answer choice B is incorrect because a buyer may accept non-conforming goods by notifying the seller of their acceptance, or failing to timely reject the goods, or doing something with the goods inconsistent with the seller's ownership. Here, the buyer accepted the goods because the buyer failed to make a timely, effective rejection to the seller. So because answer choice B wrongly states that the buyer did not accept the goods, it is not the best choice. Finally, answer choice D says the seller, because the seller notified the buyer that the mugs shipped were offered as an accommodation. And answer choice D is incorrect because although notice that non-conforming goods are offered as an accommodation will protect a seller from breach of contract when that seller sends non-conforming goods in response to a buyer's order that the seller has not yet accepted, the fact that the seller here sent an accommodation is not sufficient to create a binding contract between our buyer and our seller. That notice of accommodation acts as a counteroffer, which can be accepted or rejected. Therefore, the fact that the buyer accepted the blue mugs by failing to timely reject is what creates contractual liability for the buyer. So because answer choice D suggests otherwise, it is not the best answer to our question.